We are now going to be moving on to the panel section of our event. I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Ms. Amira Al-Ghawabi from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Amira is an award-winning journalist and human rights advocate. She spent 5 years promoting the civil liberties of Canadian Muslims as a human rights officer and later as a director of communications at the National Council of Canadian Muslims. She is currently involved with several initiatives to promote civic engagement in diverse communities, including as a founding member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, as well as the Silk Road Institute and an advisor to the Muslim Fellows in Toronto. Sister Amira, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that introduction. So good evening, everyone. It is really an important event that we're taking part in tonight. And I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to reflect and learn from the tragic events in Christchurch, New Zealand 2 years ago today. I'm pleased to be coming to you from Ottawa, from the unceded, never surrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. Before we start with our incredible panel that we have set up for you tonight, I would like to take a moment as well to think about those whom we lost that day in Christchurch, New Zealand. And if I may share with you what I wrote the day of that tragic attack. I woke up to the news from New Zealand and my hands started shaking. My stomach began to ache. Within minutes, I was scrolling through my social media feed. Soon I was telling my partner he'd have to call local police authorities to request additional security at a community event planned for the weekend. My hands were still shaking. Would families attend Friday prayers today? Even if I had planned to go, I would now be too afraid. I worried for those who would attend, refusing to let such violent hatred stop them from practicing their faith. Then feelings of relief when I realized I wouldn't have to send my son to the local private Islamic school he attends. I just don't know how I will find the courage to send him on Monday. I didn't see the whole video. I inadvertently came upon a news story that included a segment of it. I couldn't turn away, even though people said not to look. The clip showed only the first few minutes of the video of a shooter pulling out his weapons from his car while music played in the background. The camera approaches a building, clearly a mosque, and the frame freezes, although the sound of rapid-fire bullets continue over the image. The newscaster tells the audience that while everyone in the newsroom has already watched the video numerous times, they will not be broadcasting it. It doesn't really matter because tens of thousands of people have already seen it, even as social media companies were working to remove the footage. My WhatsApp feed was full of hundreds of messages talking about the brutal scenes showing a shooter killing 51 people at point-blank range. My friends wondered how they would prevent their children from seeing this, how they would explain the senseless slaughter. The terrorist who live-streamed his horrific acts had succeeded in sending a message to other like-minded individuals that Muslims deserve to die. He has succeeded in striking fear into the hearts of millions of people around the world, particularly those of us living as religious minorities in societies that may have become increasingly uneasy with our presence. It isn't as though sectarian violence is a new phenomenon in our world. There are killings between and within faith communities at almost any moment, somewhere. There is immense shock, though, when this happens in countries where there is a promise and expectation that people of all faiths and backgrounds will coexist in harmony. It shatters a collective sense of safety. It reminds us that there are those who are willing to use violence to hurt and divide us. Those who oppose inclusive multicultural communities are becoming more empowered in a world in which they can radicalize among like-minded co-conspirators and supporters online. They have become more vocal and more dangerous. New Zealand isn't alone in having to confront the ugly reality of white supremacist ideology. There are at least 100 far-right groups in Canada at last count. Hate crimes are on the rise in this country, particularly those targeting Muslim, Jewish, Black, Arab, or West Asian communities. We know that the Quebec City mosque shooter was influenced by a coterie of the who's who of the American far right. The New Zealand gunman had the Quebec City shooter's name etched on his weapons. When our federal government finally tried to address Islamophobia, racism, and religious discrimination in 2017, the effort was met with even more hate in the form of rallies and online threats. Some politicians even played along, suggesting that the whole exercise was simply a way to shut down freedom of expression. Subsequent government consultations to confront racism had to be held behind closed doors to avoid the backlash. If we are to learn anything from this latest attack on our cherished right to practice our faith freely and without fear, it is that we all have a duty to confront hatred unequivocally. We need to hold each other to a higher standard, and we must demand better from those with any power to fix what's breaking in our societies. No one should be this afraid. And with that, we'll dive into our panel tonight. Mr. Matt Ritchie is joining us. He is New Zealand Consul General to Canada. Tony McAleer is a former neo-Nazi and author of The Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. And Dr. Heidi Beirich is co-founder and CEO at Global Project Against Hate and Extremism and former director of the Intelligence Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we'll dive right in. Matt, my first question is to you. Earlier this month, on March 4th, the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand put out a news release saying that there had been threats to use car bombs at the same two mosques that were attacked 2 years ago. And the council, in the news release, specifically thanked the police for taking quick action to respond to the threat. How alert are law enforcement agencies now to the threat of white supremacist groups in New Zealand?
Thank you, Amira, and hello, everyone. Before I answer the question or attempt to answer it, I just want to say a few words. So, tihe mori ora, te whare e tune tēnā koe, te papa e wanhone tēnā koe, te ringarangama, mascurum, squamish, sabatu, thiwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ko Matt Ritchie aho, haere mai, ka te kite, kia ora koutou. So that was just a quick hello, Māori hello, and acknowledgement of the people on this call, the land and the buildings that I am currently on. I'd also just like to acknowledge why we're here today. The 51 people that were massacred in New Zealand 2 years ago, the 40 wounded, and the countless friends, families, witnesses that were affected by this tragedy. So I'd just like to say that. To your question, obviously now compared to 2 years ago, the police and other agencies are much more aware. But you will have seen from the Royal Commission of Inquiry, a lot more needs to be done, which was recognised in that big body of work around making sure that the agencies, the government agencies, were covering all threats. Before the shootings, our intelligence agencies were very focused on visiting dignitaries, big sporting events and things like that. The Royal Commission of Inquiry has recommended that we really need to have another agency set up that looks at day-to-day counter-terrorism that covers all those bases.
Right. It was very good to hear that obviously that law enforcement agencies in New Zealand had, obviously learned from this tragedy to take these issues more seriously. In fact, here in Canada, we had a similar experience as well after Quebec City, where we realized that CSIS had stopped even looking at white supremacist movements in this country before the attack on the Quebec City mosque. So it seems that there are sort of parallels in the fact that rather than the focus on the growth of white supremacist groups in both countries, there was a disproportionate sort of emphasis on looking at violent extremism within racialized communities and specifically in Muslim communities in these two countries. And so the parallels there are interesting. But I would say that even here in Canada, we know that law enforcement still has a ways to go. And I think that's what you're also saying, Matt. We just had, for instance, a fatal killing of a volunteer caretaker at a Toronto mosque this past fall, who was stabbed to death in what the police said was a random act. But within about 5, 10, maybe half an hour, we at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network were able to realize that the alleged killer actually had links to a satanic neo-Nazi group. So again, I think what we're hearing from not only communities in Canada but also in New Zealand, that there certainly is more, as you said, Matt, that needs to be done. How important was that inquiry that you're referencing, Matt, though, in terms of providing sort of that guidance and information to the public as to what needed to happen next?
Yeah, so the report hasn't been released for that long. Like the government has obviously acknowledged and accepted all recommendations and apologized for all the failings that it uncovered. But so there was the establishment of a new counter-terrorism agency, but that's all well and good. There were some other recommendations that were probably even more important, and they were around making sure that the New Zealand policy around counter-terrorism is transparent, and different groups within New Zealand can actually take part in building that policy, as opposed to it just being in a closed door room in some government building, so that different groups, whether they're different races, religions, whatever, can actually have a say in what this counterterrorism agency should be looking for. And the fact that that's transparent means that I guess everything can be seen in the light of day, including media reporting on it and various other things.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to shift over to Heidi. When we're talking about these white supremacist groups and the way that law enforcement is or isn't following up on them, what have you seen in the United States where you are, particularly when you were at the Southern Law Poverty Center and now the work that you're doing? Is society meeting the challenge that the moment requires when it comes to identifying these threats and having adequate tools to dismantle these groups and ensure that they no longer pose the threat that we're all feeling on, especially on a day like today?
Well, I'd also like to, before I answer, thank the organizers, Islam Unravelled, everyone who's here. These have been incredibly heartfelt comments that I share as I think about what happened 2 years ago, and actually many other white supremacist attacks that unfortunately have been happening worldwide in recent years. And Christchurch was so devastating. There are almost no words. As to your point, Amira, the pattern that you just laid out for Canada and that Matt laid out in terms of dealing with this threat for New Zealand is very much a similar thing that happened in the United States, especially after 9/11. We had a situation where our entire apparatus and law enforcement was focusing on a particular kind of threat, right? And it was in many ways led to some terrible disasters in terms of civil liberties for Muslim communities south of the border, south of your border. and the white supremacists had already been responsible for terrible attacks in the United States in the decade before that. Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City being a powerful and important example, which was the largest domestic terrorist attack in terms of the number of people killed in the United States at that time in the 1990s. So our entire federal government took its eye off the ball in terms of white supremacy. Law enforcement wasn't focusing on it. And, for many years when I was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, I spent time trying to lobby the federal government to take this threat seriously. And in fact, this went on all through the Bush years, all through the Obama years until 2014. And 2014 was when there was a particularly vicious anti-Semitic attack by a neo-Nazi on some Jewish institutions in Kansas. But in the months leading up to that, we had attacks on mosques, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, a Sikh temple. I mean, the pattern of white supremacists conducting these kinds of incidents had been growing and growing and growing. It was our reluctance to admit that terrorism basically can have a white face and come from your backyard and be part of your society, a result of the deeply ingrained white supremacy that's existed in the United States, that really caused us for a very long time to refuse to confront this issue. The rise of Donald Trump didn't help because he engaged in a lot of sort of courting of people with bigoted, racist, extremist beliefs. And I find that it's just now, and it's too little too late, especially after an attempted Capitol insurgency in January here, that the federal government and the Biden administration finally seems to realize that something needs to be done. So there's a big investigation being taken up here in the United States to figure out a path forward. And in some ways, there are debates over, what are the appropriate tools here? Does it make sense to have more domestic terrorism laws? We've seen those kinds of laws be used against marginalized communities in the past. The U.S. has a terrible track record here. So we're really having a debate right now about how to move forward. But this was a threat that was far too long ignored.
Yeah, absolutely, Heidi. And I think that for those of us listening to you, we know that civil liberties were also eroded, extremely in the months, years after 9/11 as well. There's a long list of people, Meher Arar comes to immediate mind, but many others as well who saw their civil liberties suspended, in the rush to find blame. And of course, the broader scapegoating of our communities that lasted for a very long time and is still with us, unfortunately. I'd like to bring in Tony in this. Tony, you yourself have been swept up in these far-right movements yourself. And I wonder, as we talk about the trends and the broader issues, if we can take a moment to try to understand, to begin with, what leads an individual to consume radical views to the extent that it would lead them to commit such an atrocity against innocent people simply gathering for worship on Friday.
Before I answer that question, I just want to preface it by saying there is no excuse or reasonable answer to that question. But the people that seem to be caught up and swept up in these movements, I'm a big believer the level to which we as human beings dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of our own disconnection and our own internal dehumanization. And I think it's an outward manifestation of that. I think Mufti Assem talked about it, the dark place that people can go to when, bad stuff happens to them. And, we find bullies are often have been bullied themselves. And it's a pattern of behavior that, it's like hot potato. We just want to get rid of it and project it onto somebody else. And I just want to be very clear here. I'm not making an excuse for the activities of those people. I'm not making an excuse for my own activities. Everything I did, I chose to do but to try and understand the lens through which we make these choices, I made these choices, can help us get to a place of understanding whereby an effective response can be formulated. But often these people are feeling alienated. They're losing they join because they don't have a sense of purpose. And what these groups offer is a sense of community. I know myself, I got power when I felt powerless. I got attention when I felt invisible. And I got acceptance when I felt unlovable. And these vulnerabilities are exploited by these groups and by this ideology in order to be a false solve, a false solution to the inner turmoil that's going on, to make sense of it and to direct that angst and anger and rage to an external target, which feels pretty good. I mean, again, to go back to Mufti Asim, when he talked about the viewing things through the lens of supremacy. Well, I know when I was viewing the world through that lens of supremacy, it was to mask that I felt completely inadequate. And it was a lens of unsupremacy going on inside, and was projecting believing that I was part of this great superior race made me feel better about the inadequacies that were going on inside. And so it's understanding how people with those vulnerabilities can be the same vulnerabilities can lead to addiction. There's a whole spectrum of antisocial outcomes that can come from those particular vulnerabilities. But this movement is quite adept at exploiting them and sucking people in.
Thank you for that, Tony. And when I listen to you, and I wonder what recommendations then would you have in terms of how we confront these issues? How do we, I think, Heidi and Matt talked about, the political, the law enforcement, the security. Is that what's required? That type of solution? Stricter laws, designating the Proud Boys as a terrorist group? Is it about, ensuring that law enforcement goes after these individuals? What recommendations do you have, having been within these movements themselves, for society?
That's a great question. And I think as a society, it's important that we call this stuff out in a healthy way. But I think as a society, we must also be prepared to call people in at the same time. And I talk a lot about, we can't lose our sense of humanity. We can't lose our sense of compassion in our response to this evil. So I talk about compassion, but it has to be accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences. And that's where the government policy, the law enforcement response, all of those things come in. But we have to call people out, but we must also, as a compassionate society, if that's what we want to be prepared to call people in. And there's ways that people can be healed and brought out of these movements. When I was with Life After Hate, I think we helped over 500 people get out. So there is the opportunity to rescue people from that world of dysfunction, but at the same time, the security and the safety and living in a fear-free world must be, the communities that have been targeted must be put first in consideration for that. I'm not saying that we need to worry about the perpetrators of this stuff first and foremost. But I think as a compassionate society, we mustn't forget about those people and bring them back, lead them back to humanity.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Tony. Going back to Matt then, and in New Zealand, I think the world really responded very much to Prime Minister Ardern's, the way that she responded with her own compassion to what happened, on that tragic day. Since then, can you describe how social cohesion, how inclusiveness, how that kind of compassion that Tony's talking about, how has that sort of been lived within New Zealand and within diverse communities there?
Yeah, so Prime Minister Ardern really led the way there. We all saw that it was she filled a leadership void. and brought out some characteristics that you've already described: the inclusiveness, honesty, that things needed to change, manaki, which is it's kind of like, it's a Maori word for respect, but it's more than respect. It's about bringing out the prestige and powerfulness of the Muslim community and things like that. And so that leadership is actually, I guess, perforated into the society. And so there's people that have never set foot in a mosque before went and did that. They went to vigils. They've been to vigils. We couldn't do it a year ago because we were in level 1 lockdown because of the pandemic. But I'm hearing reports that yesterday in New Zealand, people were holding vigils again, which is kind of what you expect for New Zealand, to be honest. We're a very inclusive society, and yes, the first reactions were shock and disbelief. Personally, and everyone that I know and saw the news reports, but we want to be proved that we are that kind of society, and so I think we're stepping up even more now because of that.
Well, that's certainly, very hopeful to hear, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. Heidi, you had talked about the influence of I love saying this, former President Donald Trump. And I know that even here in Canada, we saw hate increase by 600%. At least in one survey, in the year that he was running for president in 2015. And certainly we know the online space has not gotten much better than that. So, and you yourself have done a lot of work. In fact, you published a report linking Facebook's platform to global atrocities committed against Muslims specifically. So I wonder if you could share with us through your work, what role has Facebook had specifically when we talk about the spread of hate online?
Well, social media has been an unfortunate but incredible boon to white supremacy, really all forms of extremism, far-right populist movements. It just wasn't the case 15 years ago that you could connect hateful ideas with so many people so quickly across borders. And one of the biggest problems has been the fact that the large platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, YouTube, have essentially been unregulated for a very, very long time. This has been changing slowly in the last couple of years, but I mean slowly. And these platforms, as a result of this and this view that, the First Amendment in the United States, which is very different than the way most democracies treat hate speech, but this idea that, you should be able to see whatever you want, whenever you want online, permeated these online spaces. And we have no idea how many millions of people have been radicalized into extremist ideas over the last, 7 or 8 or 9 years. It took Facebook, for example, to ban armed militias and QAnon conspiracy theorists until right before the election this year. These were movements that affected the American elections. So it's been a big problem. Facebook in particular actually created a loophole for Donald Trump in 2015 when he first posted about the Muslim ban, his planned Muslim ban. And they made a decision that they were no longer going to apply their own standards on hate speech, incitement, and other things to any politicians, nor would they fact check any of their advertising. As a result of that, it was like a loophole that you could drive a truck through, and it has led to some very virulent anti-Muslim leaders like India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his allies in India using Facebook to actually orchestrate riots and mass killings. Probably the worst example of anti-Muslim bias coming off of Facebook was the use by the military leaders in Myanmar. The UN said that the Rohingya genocide was orchestrated off Facebook. So we have a lot of problems in the online space in terms of what is allowed to stay up, how rules are applied, how this fuels white supremacist neo-Nazi groups, but also far-right extremist movements and populism. And frankly, it's been a bit of a disaster for the world. You know, these platforms originally, claimed they were going to stitch the whole world together, but there are some arguments that could be made that it has, that they have torn the world apart in some serious ways. And I just want to say one thing about YouTube. You know, the New Zealand Royal Commission talked about how YouTube was central to the radicalization of the Christchurch attacker. YouTube is a site that is nearly unregulated even today in terms of white supremacist and other extremist content, and even monetizes it. So if we don't do something about the situation with the social media companies, we are never going to get a handle on this kind of extremism and its proliferation. There's just no way. And I just want to say to Matt, my organization just recently joined the Christchurch Advisory Network, which are civil society groups that advise the New Zealand government on Jacinda Ardern's Christchurch call. I feel that there's a lot of hope in that movement, in the Christchurch call, to get a handle on these things. So I just want to applaud your government and the French government for having done that.
To follow up on that point, Heidi, here in Canada, we are actually anticipating legislation from the federal government around the regulation of online hate. We know that a vast majority of Canadians, according to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation survey earlier this year, are in support of regulation, stricter regulation, even across party lines. And so I wonder, some of the suggested approaches include the idea of takedown. So where you have to, you require these social media platforms to take down content, within 24 hours or face massive fines. And there's some debate as to whether or not this comes down too hard around freedom of speech, because the concern that has been raised is that if you require these platforms to move too quickly, that good speech will be taken down along with the bad speech. I wonder if you could speak to that tension between removing hate speech and the concerns that those who, of course, cherish freedom of expression have, that we don't want to, move too quickly and break things in the process.
Well, this is a line, right? There has to be a decision by all of us in democratic societies where that line between dangerous speech, right, hate speech that can motivate violence and so on, and free expression needs to sit. What you're describing is very close to what the German law is, which is it has a very short period of time, I think 24 hours for the major platforms only. And if the speech isn't taken down, there are serious fines that are involved. There is some evidence that if the tech companies feel so pressured by large fines to take down speech, they will end up taking down speech that's not hate speech. This is largely because they're sloppy and not very good at what they're doing, and they can't distinguish very well between, for example, somebody who's commenting on a racist position and a racist position itself. I mean, that's just one example. But I do think that if we don't, the whole world is moving to the position that some kind of regulation has to happen, even here in the United States, which is where you might think it'd be the last place that this conversation would happen. There are already bills being put forward to, alter Section 230, which provides this blanket exemption from liability for social media companies here in the United States. And actually around the world, it's inserted in a lot of international treaties, including with Canada and Mexico. But even here, they're talking about restrictions. I think the trick here is transparency and appeals. If you're going to go down this route, which I think most people think we need to, there has to be ways to fix failures, right, which are guaranteed to happen, to make sure that people can appeal quickly, get their material back up, and hone policies and procedures over time. But I just don't think the system that we have right now is working. I mean, there have been a ton of arrests lately of young boys, 13, 14, 15 years old, in multiple countries involved in neo-Nazi activities and planning terrorist attacks. That's just a really scary situation. It's children are being indoctrinated. We just can't have it.
No, absolutely true. And the idea of transparency is actually quite an important one, Heidi. Earlier this year, there was a report that came out called Harms Reduction, a 6-step program to protect democratic expression online. It was done by the Commission on Democratic Expression from the Public Policy Forum, an excellent report. I'll try to share a link in the Zoom call for those who are on Zoom, joining us in Zoom. But it can also be looked up for those who are watching on YouTube. And the idea in that report was that you would have an appeals process, exactly that was a recommendation in order to ensure that we try to maintain that balance that is so difficult. I'll turn over to Tony. When you're thinking about that online space, we hear a lot about Facebook. Heidi's talking about YouTube, but we know that there are other channels as well, that maybe we don't hear as much about, websites like 4chan, 8chan, less mainstream than, for example, the ones I mentioned, or say Reddit even. How critical is regulating those types of spaces? Is it even possible in terms of addressing, again, the proliferation of this type of content?
I think it becomes more difficult, right? And the further sort of down the ecosystem of social media you go, the smaller the user base is compared to Facebook or YouTube or something like that. So I can't remember which platform it is, but one of them, it's a Polish guy's side hustle. The two guys have created code, and it's sort of taken off. So how do you apply those same pressures you would apply to Facebook, who can't do it with 50,000 people? How do you do it with these smaller platforms that simply don't have the resources? Reddit's not even a very big company. If you in the discussions that we had with them. So it becomes a challenge for these smaller platforms to dedicate and have the resources to handle it. And you get down to if the platform's small enough, it just isn't going to happen at all. The saving grace from that is these smaller platforms don't have the ability to infect a large number of people like Facebook can, but these ecosystems can still exist. And often they're going behind encrypted platforms for protection, so we can't even really see, or it's much more difficult to monitor what it is that they're doing. And I look at this whole movement, so almost like an energy, right? And this movement always has, even before social media, it sucked people in and it spits people out. And even though the people inside it may change, there's always people being drawn into it, and always people being spat out of it. And so it's, how do you deal with that sort of, it's almost like an entity to itself. And the challenge really with the technology is, when I was involved in the 80s and 90s, you had to send away for a book or a videotape. I just told you, I just dated myself there, but you'd have to wait weeks or maybe a month for it to come, and then you go and right away for another couple of books. The process of radicalization took months, if not years. Now you can binge watch an ideology in a weekend, and the time frame that which people can be radicalized, the time frame from which you can have access to and consume enormous amounts of misinformation is really shrunk. And if you think of the killer that murdered 9 people in Charleston, and Emmanuel American Church, I think it was. I won't say his name. I don't think we should. But he just started off with a simple Google search, black on white crime. And the other aspect to understand about these social media platforms is the role that the algorithms play, right? These algorithms are designed, they're kind of agnostic. They're designed to give us more of what we're looking for. And it doesn't really care what that is. And it doesn't take long before you search for one thing, and it's now here's 5 other choices, and we can go deep down the rabbit hole and radicalize very quickly.
Right. And so when we're thinking about what we've been talking about just throughout this evening in terms of the dehumanization of certain communities and thinking about specifically then Muslim communities. I remember reading a book by Doug Saunders, Globe and Mail journalist, The Myth of the Muslim Tide, where he talks about the way that there are, throughout history, we have seen the demonization of various communities and continue to, whether it's Indigenous communities, whether it's Black communities, in the past, Irish, Italian, there's many Japanese, Canadians, the list sadly goes on. But what I think is interesting when it comes to hate against Muslims is there's actually an Islamophobia industry that is pumping out content that is specifically divisive, specifically promoting lies and misinformation. Tony, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why in particular this kind of content seems to sadly have so much resonance amongst white supremacist groups.
I think it taps into deeper aspects of connection that can feel threatened. I think there's a certain amount of it that appeals to Christians and feeling the threat that gets made up about Islam, and Christianity. So I think it can be manipulated to apply to sort of a wider group that believes it at different levels, and I think that's what really makes it quite dangerous in the tropes that they tell. And there is a history of conflict between Christianity and Islam, going back over 1,000 years, that can be exploited and is exploited. And bringing up the Crusades and all of this European history, which has a long history with Islam, but those imagery of conflict and war and all of those things that are a normalized part of Eurocentric history can be brought to bear. It's easy for people to identify with it through that lens than it is to identify it through the lens of sort of a neo-Nazi supremacist view over Islam. And I think that's part of how it gets normalized.
So a lot to kind of try to grapple with, and the time has just been going by so quickly. I think, if we just have final thoughts from both Matt and Tony. Dr. Heidi had to pop off the call. She's on the East Coast, but if I can just get sort of concluding remarks from both of you around, again, just the significance of this day and sort of looking forward.
Thanks, Amara. So I guess in conclusion, my thoughts are that yes, there is work that governments and the political world can do, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. Like, it's myself, how I bring up my children, and all that I can do to help society do the same good things in an inclusive society. There's actually a great Maori proverb that kind of summarizes that. It's "He ata te mā, nui u te ao." It just means what's the most important thing in the world? And the answer is he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, the people, the people, the people. And we'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tony?
I think it's absolutely important that we remember the events that have happened, but at the same time maintain a sense of hope. As horrific as that atrocity was, I'm hopeful. I believe in people, and I believe in the common humanity that will prevail. And we must never forget what happened, but we must carry it forward into our living. And I think as human beings, we have this tremendous ability to inspire people, for better or for worse. And it's who we choose to be in every moment of every day. It's who we choose to be when we observe someone being harassed on the bus or at the bus stop. And I think we can teach the people around us to operate from these higher governing principles of compassion, humanity, and courage to respond to this stuff. And as human beings, we operate from one or two places. That is love or fear, and we get to choose which.
Well, on that beautiful note, thank you so much, Matt Ritchie. Thank you so much, Tony McAleer. I encourage people to read your book, and I will pass it back to Yusuf to conclude our program for this evening.
Thank you so much, Amira. Everyone, I know we went a bit over our time, but it is such an important and broad topic to be discussed. I want to end by giving my sincere thanks and appreciation for our speakers today, including Brother Kashif Ahmed, Janet Rutledge, thank you for speaking, Mufti Asim Rashid, Sonia Firstenau, thank you, Mayor Mike Hurley, appreciate you joining us today. Amira, thank you for the job that you've done in hosting the panel, it's appreciated. Tony McAleer, thank you, Matt Ritchie, and if you watch it again, Dr. Heidi Bayrich, thank you very much for everything. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Take care.